Welcome yet again to another segment in our class in Literature in English. Today we are going to be treating two poems, one from the African category and the other from the non-African segment. The poem of which we are going to be elaborating in the African segment is Vanity, put forward by Birago Diop. And then we are going to be analyzing William Morris's The Proud King in the non-African element. Now, when we talk about vanity, a quick background into the poem reveals that, of course, Africans during the period of colonization and immediately after decolonization were always tilting towards the patterns of operations of the whites. It was a period in which a normal or average African man was always believing that the African culture is to a very large extent a subservient tradition to Western lifestyles. Therefore, many Africans, including upcoming Nigerians particularly, were always aiming at operating or living like the whites should do. It is upon this background that Birago Diop put forward the poem Vanity to explain the nature of these lifestyles, of which many Nigerians had thought it's going to be a wonderful experience. But upon experiencing these things, they eventually understood clearly that the African culture is unique. It's in its own way. Now let's look at the poem Vanity. If we tell gently, gently all that we shall one day have to tell, who then will hear our voices without laughter? Sad complaining voices of beggars, who indeed will hear them without laughter? Of which we have seen a rhetorical question there, who indeed will hear them without laughter? A rhetorical question, as we had said, is a question that is raised for emphasis, of which an answer is not required. In the second stanza, the poem says, if we cry roughly of our torments, ever increasing from the start of things, what eyes will watch our large mouths, shaped by the laughter of big children? What eyes will watch our large mouth? We can see elements of repetition, rhetorical question, and oxymoron used in the context. I'll explain. You can see that the third line and the fifth line in the second stanza had been repeated in a rhetorical question format. In the fourth line, the last two words there, big children, is a clear-cut example of an oxymoron, of which it is a figure of speech where two contrasting lexical items are placed side by side. Big and children, they contradict each other, and that makes it oxymoron. Let's go to the next stanza. What hearts will listen to our clamoring? What ear to our pitiful anger, which grows in us like a tumor in the black depth of our plaintive throats? That's the use of simile. What ear to our pitiful anger, which grows like a tumor? There is the use of like there in comparing two opposite things, pitiful anger and tumor. That's simile. Now, in the next stanza, the poem reads, when our dead comes with their dead, when they have spoken to us in their clumsy voices, just as our ears were deaf to their cries, to their wild appeals, just as our ears were deaf, they have left on the earth their cries, in the air, on the water, where they have traced their signs, for us, blind, deaf, and unworthy sons, who see nothing of what they have made in the air, on the water, where they have traced their signs. And since we did not understand the dead, since we have never listened to their cries, if we weep gently, gently, if we cry roughly to our torments, what hearts will listen to our clamoring? What ear to our sobbing heart? That is vanity. Like we had explained in the poem, we had clearly seen that it's a clear-cut chastisement on African men and women who had abandoned the African way of life in order to pursue Western operations. Now we have seen clearly that the point speaker had completely chastised these people. It's a strong warning to renegades, people who had abandoned their ways of life in the African roots. They had neglected the patterns of operation which had been set by their forebears, thinking that it is quite not relevant at the time. The poet speaker called those people unworthy sons, as we had seen. Now you see it clearly that the poem seems to be a post-narration of the ugly experiences of a normal African man who had always wanted to be like the white man. That is when he said that if we tell gently all that we have to tell, all the complaints, all the problems that we have faced in the process of trying to become a white man, who will hear us without laughing at us? Who will listen to our sad complaining voices of beggars? Who indeed will hear them without laughter when we start narrating these things? Now the next stanza says that if we now try to cry roughly of our torments, our ever increasing from the start of things, what eyes will watch our large mouths? That sounds humorous. You always wanted to be like the whites, and now you had been given the opportunity to be like that. The experience becomes very, very unfortunate. Who will now listen to you? Who will listen to all these cries? Now, what hearts will listen to our clamoring? What ear to our pitiful anger? The use of hearts and ear there is simply a strong implication of synecdoche, a figure of speech known as synecdoche. Now, do not forget that synecdoche is that figurative expression where a part is used to represent the whole. The ear there is a part of the human body used to talk about the whole body. And it says this pitiful anger grows in us like tumor. All these complaints in our sad plaintive, that's complaining throats. Now, this stanza is very necessary. It says, when our dead comes with their dead, he is referring to our forefathers now. When they have spoken to us in their clumsy voices, just as our ears were deaf to their cries, to their wild appeals, just as our ears were deaf, they have left on the earth their cries. Now, it clearly explains that when our forebears, who had always been pleading with us to maintain and preserve the African tradition, when they come to hear this, they will laugh at us, since they had in so many cases and ages tried to admonish us to preserve the culture. We abandoned this culture. So what did they do? They left on the earth their cries. They left in the air, on the water, where they have traced their signs for us, blind, deaf, and unworthy sons. That is what the poet speaker calls renegades. That they are blind, they are deaf, and they are unworthy sons. Now, why did the poet speaker decide to label Africans with these demeaning descriptions? The reason is that he believes that the African man is not appreciative of his culture, having abandoned it in order to tilt towards Western tradition. And when he got there, the experiences became very unfortunate and unpleasant. So that is why he is saying, who will listen to all these complaints? When our forebears were telling you, keep this culture, you neglected them. And now you are crying, you are clamoring, you are complaining, just like what big children will do. That's why the poet speaker called them blind, deaf, and unworthy sons, who see nothing of what they have made in the air, on the water, where they have traced their signs. Now, and since we did not understand the dead, since we have never listened to their cries, yes, since we had not listened to their admonitions, if we weep gently, if we cry roughly to our torments, what heart will listen to our clamorings? What ear to our sobbing hearts? You see, that's the vanity. It says in connection to the title of the poem that this lifestyle we are tilting towards is absolutely vanity. What we need to do is to preserve our African way of life, is to put forward a unique culture of the African man which stands out from the rest of the world. Because if we try to pursue this new lifestyle of the West, it becomes very unfortunate and unpleasant. And in the end, we start complaining. We start crying. So in this poem, the poet speaker is chastising renegades. He is making a clarion call for which Africans who had turned away from Africans' way of life to return back and project their indigenous culture. Now let's look at the themes in the poem. Abandonment of traditional values. The poet speaker, of course, clearly explains this theme of abandonment of traditional values. He calls those people renegades. He refers to them as unworthy sons, those who had abandoned the Africans' way of life in order to identify with a foreign culture. So clearly, this theme is very obvious. The second is our ancestors are wise. Now, the ancestors of Africa had always admonished Africans to preserve their culture, but a lot of them had turned away in order to pursue foreign cultures. But these admonitions were abandoned. In the forerun, the expectations of our ancestors came up alive. They knew that the new way of life will not be fitting to the African man. In other words, they had forecasted pains and misery for the African man, which shows the level of their wisdom. The third is a warning to renegades, of which the renegades there are referring to Africans who had turned away from the normal way of an African traditional value should operate. Now, a renegade is a person who seems to underestimate his tradition, his way of life, his culture, and embracing other cultures. So this poem is a strong warning to them that the African culture is unique in its own way. What Africans therefore need to do is to embrace this culture and project it as a unique culture to the world. So this is clearly the issue as put forward in the poem. The fourth is pain and misery. The pain and misery as projected in this poem is the experiences of the renegades, those who had abandoned African culture in pursuits of Western lifestyle. We could see elements of pains like cries, miseries, sad complaining voices, clamorings, the tears of big children, and even tumor. All these are lexical items that are used in the poem to explain pain and misery, of which you have seen that these lexical items always portray pain and misery, and they will be, of which I will say they have been, the experiences of these renegades. Now let's look at this question. What eyes will watch our large mouths? The line above in Diop's Vanity is A. Frustrating, B. Humorous, C. Lampooning, and D. Outrageous. The correct answer to that question is contained in option B, and that is humorous. What eyes will watch our large mouths? It sounds humorous. It's a tool that is used to convey something serious. It may sound comic. You can call it an overlap of technique. We can see a technique in drama being overlapped to poetry. Now let's try to explain the next theme, the next poem, I beg your pardon, in our segment, which is William Morris's The Proud King. Now, this poem, The Proud King, is a long narrative poem that explains the life of a very popular king in a faraway country, which was named King Jovinian. Now, King Jovinian was well popular, he was respected, he was feared, his words were order, his footsteps were worshipped and licked by his subjects. At a point, he had downplayed the experiences and the achievements of his forebears. He admitted at some point that he had no need for any god, because he knew that everything he wanted was clearly at his beck and call. But God decided to show him that he was still his creation. And how did this happen? In this same country, it was obvious that King Jovinian was unable to be identified by his own people. It happened in a situation where he went to have his cool bath in a certain stream, and upon coming out of the stream, he did not see his guards, his subjects, his mates, neither could he even see his horse. At this same point, a certain angel had assumed the image of King Jovinian, of which his subject had bowed to him, thinking that he was the real king because he looked exactly like him, and they rode home with him. The people in his palace received the impostor king. His wife kissed his feet, thinking that he was the king. King Jovinian roamed around the whole society of his kingdom. Nobody could recognize him as king. They thought he was a madman. At the point when he had experienced a one-on-one or face-to-face contact with the impostor king, everybody thought that he was a madman and that the impostor king is the real king. Right before him, the horns, which is the dogs of which he used as his guards, were chasing him. He had experienced a lot of torture, a lot of pain, a lot of misery. At this point, he had made a decision to acknowledge God. He showed real restitution, and immediately he made this restitution to acknowledge his sins. He admitted at several occasions that he had sinned, and he had acknowledged the power of God over his life. God then decided to forgive him and then restored him back to his normal state. He was the only person living that actually knew this, apart from the angel who was the impostor king, and one old raven, or one old hermit, I beg your pardon, that lived in a certain city, who actually had recognized him shortly before he began to move back to his kingdom. And at some point, he was so happy that God had decided to show him mercy and salvation. He also decided to document his experiences in order to serve as a working tool for upcoming kings in his line. So the poem summarily talks about the supremacy of God. It pictures King Jovinian, who was at one point a very proud king, who underestimated both the power of his forebears and God, but eventually God decided to take away his identity. He never thought that would be the case, but it happened. And in the midst of his sufferings, he admitted his wrongs, and God restored him back to his position. Now let's look at the themes in that poem, The Proud King. The first theme is the supremacy of God. Now we had explained clearly what God did to King Jovinian by showing him that he was nowhere near God. He actually took away his identity. No one recognized him or took him for king, but another man sat on his throne. He was the only one that knew it, in addition to the angel who imposed his position, therefore showing that God is supreme. And again, the love of God had been showcased in this poem by clearly explaining that despite the pride of the king, he actually showed him mercy and salvaged his soul from damnation. The second theme is the theme of death is inevitable. Despite the wealth, the power, the glory, the achievements, and the fame of King Jovinian, we saw that King Jovinian died. So death is a portion for every man, regardless fame, power, achievement, intelligence, beauty, or what have you. Every human being is susceptible to die. So death is inevitable. But fortunately, we saw that King Jovinian died a good death, even after admitting that God is supreme. The third theme is the theme of immortality of art. Now, like I had explained briefly in that poem, art is seen as immortal. It is believed that art superlives man. Art outlives man. Art supersedes man. Man will die, but art will live on. It is clearly shown in the poem that the King Jovinian decided to document his experiences, since he was the only one living at the time to have known that. At a certain point, he believed that if he dies, these experiences will die with him. So acknowledging that documenting this experience will make the experience live on forever show clearly that art will always outlive man. Clearly, perhaps, that must have been the avenue which we had gone into this poem. The fourth is pride and vanity of material wealth. Pride and vanity of material wealth. Now we clearly see that pride and vanity of material wealth is clearly vanity. Vanity upon vanity. Pride, material wealth, energy, achievements, land, all these things will always end in the war. Now, having clearly looked at these two poems, we have seen Vanity, put forward by Birago Diop, and then The Proud King, of course, by William Morris. I believe clearly that you have understood this lesson. I strongly hope clearly that you looked at our next video. But before we close, let's look at this poem on the Proud King. The Proud King wholly makes use of dash allusion. What type of allusion does the Proud King makes use of? Is it geographical, biblical, social, or historical? The clear answer there is biblical allusion. You can liken the story to that of Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible, of which the majority of the events in that story, even though it must have been creatively put, had been coined from the story in the Bible. So that is a biblical allusion. Thanks for watching. I'm pleased to host you, and watch out for our next video. Thank you very much.